Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 is one of the most profound and significant verses in the Old Testament, and its message is central to understanding God's desires for his people, a genuine relationship and obedience, rather than merely outward religious rituals and ceremonies. Not just in the time of Hosea, but even today. The verse reads, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, an acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings, NIV." The book of Hosea was written during a time of great turmoil for the northern kingdom of Israel, around the 8th century BC. At that time, Israel was entrenched in idolatry, injustice, and superficial religious practices. While they continued to offer sacrifices and observe rituals, their hearts were far from God. Hosea's primary task was to call Israel back to a genuine relationship with the Lord, one that was based on love, mercy, and a sincere devotion to him. The people of Israel were outwardly religious, offering sacrifices, attending religious festivals, and maintaining a form of worship. However, inwardly, their hearts were corrupt, full of deceit, injustice, and idolatry. They believed that their ritualistic sacrifices could somehow compensate for their disobedience and lack of genuine love for God and others. Hosea chapter 6 verse 6, therefore, is God's reminder that he does not take pleasure in empty rituals or hollow religious acts. Instead, he desires mercy and the acknowledgement of God. In this verse, the word mercy comes from the Hebrew word hesed, which encompasses a range of meanings including steadfast love, loyalty, kindness, and covenant faithfulness. This word is deeply relational, implying that the love God desires from his people is not simply an emotional feeling, but an active, covenantal love that expresses itself in faithful actions toward both God and others. God's covenant with Israel was built on mutual love and faithfulness, and he expected his people to reflect his own character in their relationships with each other. On the other hand, sacrifice refers to the ritual offerings that were central to the worship of God in the temple. Sacrifices were an integral part of the Old Testament covenant, designed to atone for sin and express worship. However, when sacrifices were performed without a corresponding heart of obedience and love, they became meaningless. In Hosea chapter 6 verse 6, God is emphasizing that he values love and mercy over ritualistic offerings. While sacrifices were commanded by God, they were never intended to be a substitute for living in a loving relationship with him and with others. This contrast between mercy and sacrifice does not mean that God rejects sacrifices altogether. Rather, he is stating that when sacrifices are made without mercy and obedience, they lose their significance. The rituals themselves are not what God desires most, but the heart behind the action. Without love, sacrifices are empty, and without mercy, worship becomes hollow. The second part of Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 parallels the first, acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. This reiterates the point that God values relationship over ritual. The Hebrew word for acknowledgement is doth, which conveys a deep, intimate knowledge of God. It is not merely intellectual assent or factual awareness, but a profound relational knowing. God desires his people to know him personally, to understand his character, his ways, and to walk in close communion with him. This acknowledgement is not just a private experience, but one that influences every aspect of life. Burnt offerings, which were part of the sacrificial system, were important for atonement, but again, they were not sufficient in themselves to establish a relationship with God. The people of Israel had become complacent, thinking that their religious duties, such as burnt offerings, could make up for their lack of true devotion. But what God was seeking was much deeper than mere adherence to ritual. He wanted them to know him, to experience his love, and to live in a way that reflected his mercy and justice. Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 echoes a theme found throughout the Bible: God's consistent desire for authentic worship, rooted in love and justice rather than external religiosity. This same idea is expressed in several other passages. For example, Micah chapter 6 verses 6 to 8, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Isaiah chapter 1 verse 11 to 17, God condemns the empty sacrifices of the people, saying, "I have more than enough of burnt offerings. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed." Amos chapter 5 verse 21 to 24, "I hate, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Matthew chapter 9 verse 13 and chapter 12 verse 7, Jesus quotes Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 directly to the Pharisees, emphasizing that they had misunderstood the nature of true righteousness. He tells them, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." This is a clear indication that God's concern is not with legalistic rule following, but with a heart that reflects His love and mercy. These verses demonstrate that Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 is part of a larger biblical message that stresses the importance of the heart in worship and obedience to God. Sacrifices, rituals, and religious duties are meaningless if they are not accompanied by love, mercy, and a true acknowledgement of God. The message of Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 is just as relevant today as it was in the time of ancient Israel. Many people today, like the Israelites, can fall into the trap of believing that outward acts of religion such as attending church, giving offerings, or following certain traditions are sufficient to please God. However, God's desire is for our hearts to be fully devoted to Him and for our lives to reflect His character. In conclusion, Hosea chapter 6 verse 6 is a powerful reminder of what God truly desires from His people. It challenges us to move beyond mere outward displays of religion and to cultivate a heart that is filled with love, mercy, and an intimate knowledge of God. Thanks for joining me. I'm so glad you did. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to stay updated on my latest content. Your support makes a huge difference. Until next time, take care.